Building a simple microservice. So let's see how we can build a simple microservice using the ASP.NET Core. So I'm using here Visual Studio 2019. So make sure you have also installed the Visual Studio 2019 on your machine. So please install the Visual Studio Community Edition because it is free to use. So what I'm doing here, I'm just going to create a new blank solution. So let's make a search for the blank solution. So I'm having here a blank solution. Let's create it. This solution name I'm defining here, let's say simple microservice. So this is my solution file name. Let's click on the create button. Now in the solution file, let's add a new project for ASP.NET Core. So we are going to create here an API. That API we will use as a microservice. So let's do right click and here add a new project. And as a new project, I'm using here ASP.NET Core web application. Now define your application name. So let's say I'm just creating a simple microservice for the user. So I'm defining the project name as user service. Click on the create button. So it will create a ASP.NET Core application. Now you can see here these are the available templates which we can select for creating our ASP.NET Core application. So here I'm selecting here ASP.NET Core 3.1, that is the latest release of the ASP.NET Core, and here I'm selecting the API template. I'm not configuring it here for HTTPS and not for the Docker support. I'm just creating here a simple API with ASP.NET Core 3.1 support. Now let's click on the create button. So it will create an ASP.NET Web API project using the ASP.NET Core 3.1. And by default, it will have a default controller named as weather forecast controller. And it's having a model also named as weather forecast. If you want to check it here, you can click on the run button. It will run the default created API. Which we can test using the browser as well as the Postman also. So let me run it to check how it is working. After that we will do the necessary changes in the code because we are not going to use this default API. So it is returning us the default API. It's working fine. Now let's do the changes as per our requirement. So what I'm doing here, I'm removing here this default controller. I'm removing here this default model class also. That's fine. So now what we need to do here, let's create a first controller. I'm creating here a controller named as user. And make sure you are selecting the controller as API controller. Because we are not building the UI, we are building the API. So that's why I'm selecting here API controller. In the API controller, you are having here three options: API controller empty, API controller with read-write actions, and API controller with action using entity framework. So let's start with the second one because we are willing to create the other operation also for fetching the data, for adding the data, and for doing the other operation. So let's start with the API controller with read-write operation and then add. So now define this controller name as user controller. Click on that button. So it will create our user API controller. You can see using his scaffolding option for generating the code. So scaffolding is a code generation technique. The same thing it is using for generating the code for read and write operations. Now you can see here it's created here a user controller and it's also defined a route also. In the route you can see there is a API is a hard code word. Then there is a controller. Is not mentioning the action here. This is a very simple example to create the API using the ASP.NET Core, and it's having all the CRUD methods. So it's having the get all, get by ID here. It is for adding the new record. It is for updating the existing record, and it is for deleting the record. And all these methods are empty. So now based upon the requirement, we will write the code over here. So now let's check it how it is working. Later on I will add here the way how to fetch the user from the database. So let me run the code to check it. So our API name is not here weather forecast. Our API name is API/user. And you can see I'm getting here value 1 and the value 2. And this value 1 and value 2 is returning by this get method. It means our API is working fine. So this is the way how we created here a simple ASP.NET Web API. Creating database for microservice. So when we create a microservice, so each microservice has its own database to persist its state. So same way what we will do, we already created here a user microservice. So there we will create its separate database also. So we will use here entity framework core for defining the entities, and based upon the migration we will create the database. So let's see how we can create it. So for defining the entities here, let's do one thing. Let's create here a one more folder with the name database. I'm adding here a folder with the name database, and in the database folder I will add the entities. So here I'm adding here a one more folder for entities. In entities folder I will add an entity named as user. So I'm adding here a class user, and in the user class I will add the properties for which we are willing to create the columns. So let's define the property name as user ID. I have defined here, and add here others properties also. Let's say string name. I'm using here name, then address and contact. So it is here address, it is here contact. So this is the way how we added the properties into the user class. Now we can define here the database context for creating the database for these entities. So what I'm doing here, I'm just adding here a class at the database folder level named as database context. I'm adding here database context class, and here for using this user entity we need to install here the entity framework core NuGet package. So just right click in the dependencies and go to the option manage NuGet packages, and here go to the browse option, and when you are using the browse option make sure you are connected with the internet to download the NuGet packages. So I'm just making here search for Microsoft.entity framework core. So this is the package you need to install here. So it is a 3.1 because we are using here ASP.NET Core 3.1. That's why the package name is also 3.1 we are selecting here. It is also targeting the .NET Core 3.1. Now accept the license. So after installing this package, all the entity framework core features you can use over here. But here we are using here a relational database also. So now you have to decide what the relational database you are using. So we will use a SQL Server. So let's install here one more package for the SQL Server. So depending upon the RDBMS, please download the package for entity framework core SQL Server like entity framework core MySQL. So we are using a SQL Server, that's why I'm downloading here SQL Server. And here we are willing to perform here the code first migration. So for migration we need a tools package. So this is the tools package you need to install. After installing this package we are able to run these commands. Let's say add migration, drop database. So what are the various migration commands we have? We can use here after installing this package. So let's install this package also. Accept the license. So all the three packages we have installed which are required for creating our database. Now let's inherit it from DB context class. This is the built-in class in entity framework which is responsible for managing the database connection. I'm using here public DB set and just add the classes for which you are willing to create the entities. So I'm willing to create here the tables for user class. So I added here the user class. Simple. Now we need a database connection string. So the database connection string we can define here within a method So there is a method in the DB context class. That method we can override here. So let me override a method here. Override on model configuring is a method which we can override. So that is on configuring method which we need to override. Now we need to define a database connection string. So there is a method on configuring in DB context class. That method we need to override here. So let me override the method here. Override and on configuring. And here let me define the database connection string. So let's define the connection string as per your system. So I'm defining the connection string as per my system. Use like option builder, then use SQL Server, and then pass your database connection string. So I'm passing the connection string as per my system. So here just copy your data source, and then define your database name. Let's say my database name is here user microservice would be my database name. This is a user ID, this is the password I mentioned over here. So we have defined here a entity for which we will create the database table, and this is the database connection string we have defined. Now we can use the migration for creating the database. So for using the migration, just go to the tools, then there is a NuGet package manager console, and now here you need to run the command add dash migration and migration name as initial. So we are doing the migration first time, that's why I'm giving the migration name as initial. If everything is fine, it should work. So you can see here it's added here a migration file named as initial, and here it's added here up method and the down method. So method is here for migrating the model changes into database. So it's creating here a user table in the database, and it is following here plural naming convention as per the Entity Framework core default rules. If you are willing to learn Entity Framework, so please refer the Entity Framework code section in .NET Tricks. This is for down. Now let's commit these model change in database by running the command update dash database then space dash verbose. I'm using here verbose flag to see all the generated SQL command behind the scene Entity Framework for generating our database. So it is trying to generate the database. So it successfully generated the database here. Now let's have a look by opening the database. So this is my SQL Server. I'm just opening here. Let's see whether it's created the database or not. So you can see here I'm having here a user microservice containing a table named as users. And here for testing the API, let me add here a default entry in the user table. So what I'm doing here, I'm adding here a user name as let's say Mohan, address let's say Noida, contact number. Contact number, let's say I'm adding here a fake contact number. That's it. So this is the way we created the database. Now let's write the code in the user API for returning the list of user. So now it will return here the list of user here. I'm passing the user class, and here what we need to do, we need to create the instance of this database context class also. So let me create here database context class instance. I'm creating here a very basic things, so I'm not following any design patterns for using the Entity Framework core database context. Normally I'm creating the things here. So let me create here database context class instance and just initialize it at constructor label new database context. Now we need to return the list of users. So let me use here Entity Framework core style for returning the list of user. So this is the way we can return the list of user perfectly. Now let's run the code to check how it is returning the list of user. And we already added here a default user here in the database. Now let's run the code to check how it is returning the list of user. So now let's run the code to check how it is returning the list of user here. So let me change the URL here API/user. So let me do mention a proper URL here API/user. And now you can see it is returning here our added user Mohan. So I'm getting here Mohan. I'm getting here that the result as a formatted one because I have installed extension for JSON parsing. If you build in the row, you can get the data like this way. But I have installed here a JSON parser, so that's why I'm getting here the parse result set like this way. In this way, our API is working fine along with the entity framework core, and it is properly returning the data from our database table user. Now let's quickly complete the other operation also. Here we are returning a single user here based upon the user ID. So let me complete this code also, db.users, then there is a find method here for returning the user based upon the ID, means based upon the primary key. But make sure return type is your user here. Perfect. Now when you are willing to add a new user, so we also need to receive here the model as user. So do receive model as user here. And here it can be the case you might be facing the issue while adding the user. So what you can do, you can use a try catch statement, try, and here I can use a db.users, then add, and here I'm using here model. And now I do commit the changes here so that everything would be saved in the database. And here is a return type, there should be here iAction result. So I'm defining here the return type as here iAction result. Now here let's define here the return type. So return type would be here return status code is a method here which we can return here. So here you can pass here the status code as a number, but here I'm just going to pass the status code here with the help of a class status codes. Status codes dot, you will find it here 201. So 201 we mentioned for as a notification to the client, like a new record has been added into the database. If you want to return the model also, like created user, so I can return here model also this way. So this is the way we are able to return here the notification the user has been added. If there is an error, we can return here error. So as error code should be here internal server error 500. So there is a status code status 500 as internal server error, and don't return model over here, there should be only error. If you want to return the message, so message you can return here as a ex this way. The other code I'm not writing here because we are not willing to implement others code. So these three methods are fine. In one method I'm returning all the users, in another method we are returning here a single user, and one method I'm using here for adding a new user. Testing ASP.NET Core Web API. So what are the web API we created? Let's test it to check it's working fine or not. So for testing we can use here a REST client. I'm using here REST client as Postman. So make sure your API is running. So let me run my API. After that I will check it. So it's running my API, and my API address is here, and my API address is here API/user. And the same address I can use in the Postman also. This is the way. So just click on the send and you will get all the users in the database. I'm getting here users here properly. Now let's try to check a single user. So I'm passing here user ID is 1. So right now it is returning an array, but when I'm mentioning here user ID, it should return here single object. Click on the send button. Now it is returning a single object. It means our method is working fine, which is returning the single user here. Now let's check for adding a new user. I'm just making here post request. In the post request I'm just using here body. In the body I'm using here the raw format, and as a data type I'm using here JSON. And what the JSON we have, the similar type of JSON we need to pass whenever we are willing to create a new user. User ID you don't need to pass, it is optional because user ID is a auto increment column in the database. So this time we are willing to create a new user with the name, let's say Krishna, let's say Delhi, and I'm passing here any contact number. So make sure you have mentioned here row option and you have selected the data type as JSON and method name as post. So these are the three things you should mention here, and you don't need to pass any parameter in the ID, it's fine. Because if you build in the post, we're just receiving here user model that it will read from the request body. Same thing I'm doing here. In the request body, I'm passing the data. Make a send request. And you can see it's returning here the status code as 201. Even it is returning the generated user along with the user ID. It means it's successfully created the Krishna as a new user for us. You can check it by making a request for fetching all the users. So you can see I'm having two users here, Mohan and Krishna. So this is the way how we checked our API. It's working fine through our Postman.